We have become addicted to information, and one of the biggest reasons we stay stuck is that we believe, not just think, but we deeply believe that more information will actually change our lives. It won't. It's actually the opposite. In this video, I'd like to show you how an information-saturated world isn't actually the environment we're wired for. I'd like to share with you why modern attempts at rewiring not only fall flat, but actually keep you stuck and overwhelmed. To get you unstuck, I'd like to accomplish 3 simple things. I want to share with you why more information doesn't lead to meaningful change, how chronically seeking new information has become a modern addiction, and finally, how to break that habit and become somebody who executes and embodies their values. Before we jump in, it's worth noting that I obviously don't think learning itself is bad. I encourage my daughters to try their best in school, and I always remember that learning came before application in the Marine Corps. But we need to acknowledge that sometimes, too often, we abuse it. We use learning as a convenient form of avoidance. Instead of applying what we know to the best of our ability and learning through feedback as God intended, we keep learning and relearning things that are marginal or redundant or make us feel smart but don't actually move the needle. All of this becomes a subtle way to keep the real work at arm's length. Saying that you're learning something new has the luxury of sounding productive, but underneath it is the psychology of avoidance. Now, more than ever, our intent, the spirit of why we choose to learn something in the first place, is extremely important. Do we intend to use that new information for some tactical or strategic benefit? Is what we're learning going to be applied immediately so we gain a deep understanding of that subject? It doesn't need to be exact, but does that new information fit into some general trajectory that we actually care about? If so, learning remains one of the highest leverage behaviors that we can engage in as we try to change our lives. But our minds aren't always straightforward, and our subconscious has a substantially larger influence than many of us care to admit. When I was a psychology grad student, I learned this quote before it became popular. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And that's a good foundation for point number 1. Acquiring knowledge and applying knowledge are 2 different processes. I used to run a personal training department at an LA Fitness in my 20s. I'd meet new people, they'd share their stories with me, and we'd go over what personal training actually involved. Not once was a person surprised when they heard that it involved physical training, nutritional discipline, rest protocols. There was no curveball or hidden secret, they already knew what to do. This made me curious why they'd share their story with me in the first place. If they knew what to do, why didn't they just go and do it? But that curiosity led me to an insight that many of us already know but struggle to accept. Knowledge, information, wasn't the issue. Application of that knowledge was. That's how it always is. Reading about deadlifts isn't the same thing as actually approaching the bar, feeling your way toward proper foot placement, sinking into a hip hinge. Learning something on paper doesn't account for the messy reality, the dozens of micro adjustments that are needed just to make initial progress. That messiness, when things start to deviate from theory, is when our brains start to go haywire. It's when previously straightforward knowledge is no longer straightforward. When that happens, the part of the brain that we use to initially acquire the information, the prefrontal cortex, is no longer online. The amygdala is. A lot of people, yourself probably included, have heard of the amygdala. And maybe you have a decent idea that the amygdala has something to do with fight or flight or freeze, and you'd be right. But it's also more than that. When we switch into a fearful emotional state, such as when we need to fit that new information that we just learned into a real-world situation, our brains freak out. Automatically and subconsciously, they begin to prioritize threat detection and survival, not creativity or exploration. While a deadlift may not be scary, transitioning from one career to another is. Checking your ego when your spouse is trying to tell you something important but uncomfortable is. Examining why you get angry at objectively small things is. Messy situations produce discomfort that words on a page and theories can't really capture. The functional consequence of that is that our clean theory no longer has a place in the rough and unpredictable reality that we need to operate in. For this reason, we need to place our focus on being emotionally stable, so we can access what we already know rather than superficially learning to soothe our anxiety. Last part here before we move on to the next section. Our brains prefer known pain to unknown progress. We all know that it doesn't feel good to keep getting angry or irritable or nervous, but it does feel familiar, and that's the point. Our brains will always prefer what is familiar and predictable over novelty, even if that novelty has real upside. This is why driving to work where you go every day is easy, but getting to that part of the city that you never really go to is stressful. Your brain doesn't have a map for what it doesn't know. This is why shooting my first machine gun in the military was nerve-wracking, but after thousands and thousands of rounds, it became second nature. Going from what we know, our existing body of knowledge, to applying that knowledge is new. And because it's new, not good or bad, but new, it's already flagged by our brain as a potential threat. After all, the unknown is scary, and even though we may not have specific concerns, we do have a feeling that something unpleasant may be lurking in the fog of a new experience. This is another reason why to transition into actual life change, we need to focus on strengthening our hearts and minds, not just consuming information. When we don't have a tolerance for uncertainty, we make attempts to compensate. In the absence of clarity or a guaranteed outcome, we try to manufacture that certainty. In that process, we run the risk of doing a lot of dumb, destabilizing things. And that basic human tendency goes a lot further back than psychology textbooks. Here's a quick example as I'm reading through the Old Testament and soaking in what I can. In one of the books, 1 Samuel, there's a king. His name is Saul. As Saul is facing an enormous enemy, he has standing orders from God through Samuel to remain patient. Samuel will be there in 7 days to offer a sacrifice and provide instruction for next steps. While Saul does that at first, his own army becomes impatient and worried. That's when Saul becomes preoccupied with how he looks and what's going to happen. Tension builds, the stakes get higher, and Saul eventually caves. He conducts an unauthorized sacrifice before Samuel shows up. This kind of behavior from Saul would show up again in 1 Samuel 15. Saul's decision to break faith and cave to that social worry, to that pressure of survival, had serious consequences. It cost him his dynasty. His family would no longer be considered for the royal line. And this is what begins the drama with David. Here's the point. Saul's story is easy to judge. We all know that comparison is the thief of joy, but we compare anyway. We care about how others perceive us, and how we stack up against other individuals and our culture more broadly. In that way, Saul's greatest sin is one that we can all relate to. And while sometimes we can adapt healthily to uncertainty, other times we fall into this trap of constantly seeking reassurance where there is none. One of the ways we do this in the 21st century is on our phone. ChatGPT, Google, YouTube. These aren't just access points for information, they can be accelerators of our own anxiety. Every time we Google something or ChatGPT something and don't immediately apply it, we condition our minds to consume without corresponding action. In other words, we build hollow habits. Here's a quote from my book, Rewired. Bad habits reinforce the bad narratives we have of ourselves, because the more we do a thing, the more we integrate it with our identity. Many of our subconscious habits and behavioral routines aren't necessarily bad. They just foster a lukewarm pattern of being that doesn't truly capture our potential or vision. There is nothing uniquely corrupt or terrible about constantly consuming information. But, just like any other pattern of avoidance, it robs us of actually engaging with the real work. I don't know what your goal is, but let's say for the sake of conversation, you want to get in shape. Let's say you want to put on about 10 pounds of lean muscle in the next 3 to 6 months. After you learn the fundamentals enough to actually get going, what do you think would be more useful? Learning about hypertrophy and muscular development, or training consistently week over week? The answer is obvious, but not for the reason you may think. Yes, we all know that the act of training will take your understanding into a real kinetic form, but it also does something really important. It exposes what we didn't anticipate. Maybe getting to the gym has additional barriers that you didn't account for, like traffic or your morning routine feeling stretched thin because you need to get the kids on the bus. Maybe you realize there's an imbalance between your anterior and posterior and you need to spend a little bit of time rehabilitating before building. None of those realities, those blind spots, would have been exposed if you didn't start engaging. Conversely, they would have stayed stuck, hidden in your subconscious had you stayed in the learning phase. So in a very real way, actual learning isn't static at all. It's when you marry what you know with the real world. ChatGPT and Google fill us with dopamine. It feels good to learn. And because it feels good to learn, we fool ourselves, we trick ourselves into thinking that the task is done. That reinforces the avoidance pattern and puts more distance between us and action. The word addiction comes from the Latin word adicere, which is an old legal process of not being able to pay back your debts. As a result, if you can't pay back those debts, you become enslaved to your creditor. The origin of that word, of addiction, the spirit of it, is when we abandon our freedom. And in the modern world, there are many things that try to steal our freedom. One of the biggest ones that doesn't get enough attention is our need for certainty. Whatever gets in the way of you becoming the person that you want to be, whatever discomfort your brain is trying to avoid, that's your addiction. Our brains were wired for targeted selection and then immediate engagement. Once we either hit the target or miss, we adjust and continue adjusting until we achieve the desired outcome. This isn't me making this up. This is actually hardwired into our brains by something called action outcome tracking. Action outcome tracking is our brain's built-in process of ensuring there's a feedback loop between our behavior and the environment. We take a step forward, collect data from that step that we just took, and then adjust forward. The tighter the feedback loop, the tighter the action outcome tracking. In an information-saturated world where we habitually take in knowledge without corresponding action, that natural alignment, that natural process is broken. There's a bump in the evolutionary pattern. In other words, our modern world is not aligned with how our brains evolved. So what does this mean for you? To finally break the stuck cycle, you need to focus on small points of meaningful execution, on accessing what you already know. Once you begin executing, the action-outcome cycle kicks in. And if you reflect and ask the right questions, this can give you a unique edge in the modern landscape. Here's a good question. Did whatever you do today move you closer to your goal? If yes, great. Where did your efforts fall short? What were your barriers, to the degree that there were any, and were they internal or external? How did you or could you overcome them? If your behavior didn't move you closer to your goal, were you avoiding? If so, why? What was the core fear driving that avoidance? How could you overcome that? When you nest good questions inside the intent to execute, magic happens. You won't feel your brain rewiring. There won't be any formal sign that anything is changing. But you'll begin to orient yourself a little bit differently in the modern world, through a lens of application, and that's how gradually getting unstuck actually occurs. As always, remember that God gave you everything you need in your heart to overcome your mind. If you feel stuck in any life domain and think that you could benefit from some one-to-one coaching, feel free to reach out to me at this email and we can see if it's a good fit. Finally, if you like conversations like this and you're looking for a simple first step, you can also check out my book, which is linked below. Or you could also hop onto my email list for weekly lessons beyond these videos. You don't have to stay stuck. Start executing.